Welcome back to another live stream. Today I'm going to be covering economic modeling, specifically a video I made over a year ago for my national model. It should be cringeworthy. That's why I wanted to do it, but I also want to cover some of the basics between DSGE modeling and system dynamic modeling. Stay tuned.
You are now relearning economics.
Hope you are all well. Make sure you hit that notification bell if you're just tuning in. That way you can see all my videos until the day you die or I die. Hit that like button, comment underneath the video when it's done. Or if you got comments live, put them up in the chat. Same thing on X. You can put your comments there. Hit that heart button, repost it, and chat in the live chat. I'm going to do a reaction video for my own video today. I know it's crazy, it's revolutionary, and it should be cringeworthy, just the way I like it. I watched this video actually again for the first time in a long time since I basically first made it, and it was an introductory. I'd basically finished my national model, and I wanted to kind of put it out there and see what people thought. Ultimately, I got hooked up with modern macro technologies, and we kind of went from there. And I pulled the video, off my YouTube, off X, and I left it on my Patreon. I decided to revisit it because again, I'm going to react against myself. I'm always improving in life. So if I look backwards, it's always cringeworthy. I'm sure everybody's got that experience. 2, we need to kind of cover these topics more. We need to really look. We do abstract little dynamic models, but we need to do something with substance, right? To see how far we can take, the technology we have now in software programs to do complex systems. So I want to do that today. I put out a promo code for my Patreon. So if you want to sign up for my Patreon right now this month, you get 50% off each tier using promo code Livestream. Just for you Livestream viewers, it's there. So, join me over on Patreon. I love you guys there. That is the place where I'll reply to the fastest, right? I may not get to my X or my YouTube, but I will always get to my Patreoners because you guys are important. So make sure you do that. I want to kind of just get right into this video. Leave your comments in the chat if you have any questions about it. Of course, I'll be stopping on the way through because it'll be fun to make fun of myself. So here it is. I'm doing a video again. It's been almost a year. I've taken some time off. Okay, just for some context, when I did this video, I had almost taken a year off social media. So no X, no YouTube, no Patreon. I was on some sort of life journey there. And so I came back, and during that time, I was working on the national model. And so this was one of my first posts I put out, just to give context of where I was at the time. And I wanted to kind of show the work I've been doing over the last year. It's involved basically, a book and a very large system dynamic model that is a representation of a national economy and its emergent behaviors. The point of this video really is to show it is a flight simulation tool. So you can run the simulation and affect certain policy options and see what the results are. Obviously, the hopes are that, politicians in the future, go Blue Jays, go. This Saturday playoff start
version of this model, and instead of testing new ideas on the economy live in real
I'm
time,
doing pretty good
destroying
here.
people's lives. They can
So
run
far,
these
so good.
tests
I'm
in the
not. This is
model
not too
to see what
cringeworthy.
kind of emergent behaviors
I'm actually the cringeworthy
occur.
one right now. Actually, if you
This
think
is
about this,
not going to
it's
be an exercise
cringeworthy
on how
to
the
do
model works.
this
That's going to be
and
in my
review
new
your
book
own video.
called
So maybe
Relearning
this is the
Economics,
cringeworthy
hopefully
review.
out by the spring of 2025. But I wanted to just kind of show the simulation power, a quick kind of run through of all the model elements, just to give you a basic idea of how the model works. But I'm not going to go through the hundreds of equations by any means. I'm going to make this model download available to.
Look at all those old graphics I had for relearning economics. This was a few months before that. I changed my name, like my online, handles from Ty Keens to relearning economics, and it was branding for my book, which I'm still writing. Writing a book's really hard.
To my paid Patreon viewers. So if you're watching this on my Patreon, you can hit the download link, download the model. So if you want access to it, you're gonna have to pay me a little bit of money each month. I think my
A little bit.
lowest
It's just a
tier is
little bit of
around
money.
$2
Just a little
and
bit.
50 cents American. So not all that much money. You also
Yeah.
need a new copy of Minsky. Minsky is now being sold. You can basically go to the
So this is before the official name change from Minsky to Ravel. It's now called Ravel, but I'll probably always call it Minsky.
Patreon site for Minsky, and I'll provide that link in the description in the blog post for Patreon, and download it so you can sign up for $1 a month. Download the Minsky software. And then cancel your subscription if that's all you want, or keep the subscription going so you're always getting the newest updates to Minsky, because there's always new features being added, any little bugs being adjusted. So I'll put that in the description as well. So anyways, yeah, I'll go through the kind of the overall model here. Basically, we can start with the godly tables. Godly tables are basically balance sheets. You've got your assets, your liabilities, and your equity, all your stocks along the top, and all your flows along the side. Double entry bookkeeping, so there's always going to be two entries. Mainstream economics says, money is neutral, so you don't need to model it. Well, if you consider that banks are expanding credit,
And I just want to say a year has gone by and mainstream economics still considers money to be neutral. Nothing's changed on that front.
the demand of loans from consumers and firms and whatnot, that's easily considered a component of aggregate demand. So if you're not modeling money, you're not modeling the economy. So that's a big feature in this model. It's broken up into representative kind of agents. So we have the representative bank. That means, aggregated banks. We have representative households. So that's all the households combined.
So if you got any questions, if you're watching this live about the model itself, just put them in the chat. We'll address them at the end of the video. If you got any questions, if you watch a recording of this later, put them in the comments. I'll address them later.
And we have the representative firm. That's all the firms aggregated together. We have a foreign sector. We've, of course, got the monetary authority, i.e. the central bank. We've got the physical authority, the treasury or government, federal government in different countries. We have representative capitalists, and the difference between capitalists and households in this model is, well, one's the rich household.
So when I started working with modern macro technologies, Doug was like, capitalist is a pretty derogatory term for a successful person. And so we changed it to high net worth households. But capitalists in this model is essentially, wealthy people that own the means of production, et cetera, et cetera.
One's the medium to low income household. And we have some other miscellaneous plots in the model. And of course, the equations, so if I go back to the household, these are just static definitions. They're not actually showing the change through time. That's what system dynamics is. It's studying the change of elements over time and their behaviors. So it's important to have in accounting terms those static definitions. If the household gets a loan, their deposit account goes up, which is an asset, and then their liability, which are loans, goes up equally, balancing the row to zero. The accounting rule, of course, is A minus L minus E should always equal zero. But of course, there's background equations to all of that. So we can go through some of them. And I'm not going to really spell them out for you, but to give you an idea. So I showed you the representative household godly table, right, which shows the static definition. It has some plots here. So when we're running the simulation, you can see what's going on. But there's actually underlying equations that create the dynamics. And in system dynamics, we aren't dealing with open-ended loops or open-ended statements where we say if we, and I'm just, throwing something out there. I don't necessarily believe it's right or wrong, but you raise interest rates and that suppresses demand. That's an open-ended loop.
I guess it's very important to say that in system dynamics, we don't have A to B thinking. We have A to B to C back to A thinking. We close all our loops, right? And that means, none of the parts of the system will dictate the system. The interaction of the different parts of the system creates endogenous behavior.
Open-ended loop statement. But the reality is everything is closed. Everything's a closed loop, and you'll kind of see these loops being formed in the equations. And these are closed loops. So everything is feeding back into each other. There's no such thing as, well, I'm going to raise interest rates, and that's going to give me option A, right? And end it right there, because that's not the reality. Option A is going to affect X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z is going to affect B, C, and D, and it's all going to loop back into each other. And that's not claiming that there's circular arguments, because we're not just dealing with a bunch of flows.
Alex, have you ever used any of the tools at appliedmmt.com for any investment strategies? Be interested to know, or if not them, do you use any other, third-party tools, or did you just learn yourself?
Looping back into each other. We're dealing with stocks and flows. So your stocks are your information of your system, right? And the flows are the transmission of that information. The stocks help disentangle all the flows in the model, right? So each section has the equations that, and this is subjective. So I'm saying the household makes the decision to buy houses, right? So I've just put the equations in the representative household equations, right? Firms, they have a set of equations.
I regret at the time using representative anything, because that kind of gives the impression that I've got some sort of representative agent model where all the agents are the same and they have perfect knowledge of the future. And that is not the case. I think I recall using that term when I was just laying out the model to make it more familiar to conventional economists, but fuck conventional economists. I don't know why I did that. I should just have used like firm sector, household sector, etc., etc.
When you download this model, you have the tabs at the top. That's kind of your interfaces. And then if you go in your bookmarks, you can look at all the different equations. So we are at household, we'll go to firms. So then firms have, all the production equations and all the feedback loops that are involved there, all the different functions that dictate behaviors in the model. Just to let you know, this model has 37,000 feedback loops. So it can answer questions for you that, the mental model in your brain.
I was bragging there. 37,000 feedback loops. It is true. Some are more dominant than others, but feedback loops are very exponential. So as your model grows, So let's say you start with a very small model and it's got 7 feedback loops, right? And then you add a new system state and you plug that into the model. And of course, you add a couple, 2 new feedback loops. Well, those feedback loops come passed to the other 7 feedback loops. So now you got 14, right? Or something like that. It depends on how you structure your model. So quite quickly, a model with hundreds of variables can have tens of thousands of feedback loops, right, interacting with each other.
In your brain is just not going to be able to answer. And I made, a big point when I was designing this model is I dropped all the economic theory that I knew. For the most part, each school has
It's the
one
way to
real
go.
big fundamental
Self-taught. Good
insight,
job, Alex.
and the rest is a superstructure that's built around it, basically creating a culture and an ideology. I drop all that shit. It's just not important to me. So I made sure to start and go back from simple first principle logic. And you can still
About
make
2
a
years
very
ago, Reagan,
complicated, complex
somewhere around there,
system
started to do it
dynamics
more
model
frequently.
With first principle theory in mind. And I think that's the best theory. We can look at the data if you want to be inductive, and you see, the most dominant thing that presents itself in that data, and that's your first principle. You could have, some deductive reasoning as well that's very coherent. There might not be that data, that strong data to back it up, but I don't mean to sound like an Austrian, but logic is logic. Smart is smart. There are things.
I always as you can see, there's a linear trend of me always making fun of the Austrians. I shouldn't do that, but what I was trying to say there is they are deep thinkers, right? So you got to use your brain. Like you can see all the data you want, but you've got to use your brain, right? And sometimes to find the data, you've got to use your brain first. So maybe inductive is before deductive, or maybe deductive is before inductive. It really depends on the situation.
There are things that you just know that are true. I always advocate that you should be backing it up with some sort of reality you see in the real world, and that's all subjective in itself. So we go and we can check out the capitalist equations. So they have their set of equations. The banks have a set of equations. Foreign trade has a set of equations. The monetary authority has a set of equations. The fiscal authority has a set of equations. And all these equations are interlocking with each other. I've just separated them into modules, just so it's an organized model. Yeah, pricing dynamics. And then, of course, you have all your miscellaneous equations to calculate GDP, the share of income, et cetera, and then element.
What I mean about miscellaneous equations is, so economics puts a lot of emphasis, let's say, on GDP and CPI. But I've found, that there are causal behaviors when somebody looks at GDP and oh, okay, it's there, or it's CPI or unemployment. More specifically, unemployment. It's a great driver in aggregate to show some aggregate behavior. But essentially, you got to really get under the hood and look at other variables in a macro system to understand what drives the behavior, what's the relationship. Because when you go from micro to macro, it's not the same. You don't scale up, and now a group of people are looking at profits. There's no such thing. What you're looking at as in aggregate, a large system, right? So that doesn't scale from individuals all adding up together. You're looking at a system. It's distinct in itself. And you've got to find relationships that aren't intuitive in the macro or in the micro sense, that would be intuitive to a single firm per se, right? So a lot of the like GDP, for instance, it's very questionable what causal influence just the number being printed has, right? Because there's no group of firms that are like, oh, this group of firms just saw GDP is decline, we're going to lower production, right? That doesn't really happen that way, right? So it's the two different worlds, the micro world and the macro world, and you can't scale You can't use micro foundations to build macro, which conventional economics says you need strong micro foundations. That's just not the case. You can, however, go from the macro down and drill down into the system to get more granularity, to understand how microsystems work by drilling down. You can do it that way, but building up is it's quite fallacious to try to do that.
And elements that basically are put into the tabs up top, they're laid out in the canvas here. But really my main goal, and I guess we can look at the Phillips diagram. It's kind of just a little neat flow chart. These wires will pulse depending on the intensity of the flows. And these are stocks all represented in the godly tables or balance sheets. But the main thing I wanted to show today was the interface. And I'm going to start this model run with some very base assumptions. There's no government spending, no direct household spending, no government spending on the firms. The central bank is not purchasing or selling bonds to start the money.
So one of the neat things with Ravel is you can use it as a flight simulator. So some other system dynamic programs do that, but not to the degree. It's very native in Ravel. So you just press the play button and you can run the simulation really slowly, and then you can react to the endogenous behavior. And then try to initialize different policies that you think would help, right? And the whole idea with that is to put that in front of a policymaker and have them react in a simulation world where they're getting real-time data and they have to react to it. And of course, with anything, and especially in a dynamic system, there are lags, et cetera, and that can make decision-making policies a lot harder than, is conveyed through conventional economics.
And there are no taxes, and we'll add those as we go through. And you'll notice at the bottom of the screen we have some shock options we can put in there. We can put a population shock. We can put which is basically
I think it's also important to note that, with a DSGE model, which stands for Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium, time is actually dictated by shocks themselves. So you have a shock that perturbs the model from its equilibrium state, and then it's optimized to return to that equilibrium state another point in the future. So the shocks themselves are time, whereas continuous time models, they're literally just iterating and very small chunks of discrete time. So you could have, like, in this model, I think it's every 16 hours in real time. It iterates economic activity. And so that's a big fundamental difference is a dynamic system like this isn't optimized to start from an equilibrium, have a shock, and then jump to the next equilibrium point. It's not that. In fact, if you think about the Lorenz system, so the butterfly system, it has 3 equilibria, and sometimes those equilibriums repel and sometimes they attract, and we call those strange attractors. And that's very, very different from a DSGE model where they don't have that. Essentially, equilibriums are attract the system towards it, and you just optimize it how quickly it returns to that. But in this model, I did introduce like a capital utilization shock, a productivity shock, and a population shock. And so you can initialize those shocks as the model's running dynamically to see how real shocks operate in a real system.
A shock to the worker population. We have a productivity shock and we have a capital utilization shock. We'll hit some of those on the way through. If you download this model and you have Minsky, I suggest you turn the speed.
Yes, actually. So we have a forecasting model that was based on this toy model. This was kind of the hybrid, model that our skunks work kind of type model. And we calibrated this to the U.S. economy, and then we use its outputs to develop investment strategies. I don't work in that department. I just do the modeling. And so it's one of the bases for modern macro technologies, which is our kind of institutional arm for institutional investors as another way to analyze the macroeconomic system.
Right here down to the slowest, because you want to kind of see the dynamics as they're occurring in real time and make policy decisions. You press the play button and this model will start to run. And again, I'm running it very slowly. You know, going into this model run for this demonstration, I'm looking over at inflation and I want to kind of keep it in that 3 to 1% realm. I'm going to be looking at output growth.
I don't know if I said it in the video or not. This is a toy model run, so it's a generalized capitalist system, what I'm running here. And what I'm just demonstrating is that you don't get like business cycles through the traditional way that, you know, new Keynesian economic modeling, which is just a fluffy version of new classical or neoclassical DSGE modeling. You don't get cyclical behavior from exogenous shocks. The system itself is producing what you're going to see here. I'll maximize it in a second. The behavior itself comes from the interaction of the different parts of the system. You can then introduce shocks into the system, for instance, like a capital utilization shock, to explore what pandemic lockdowns would do and how that qualitatively affects the economy. But in this specific model is a hybrid kind of test model, so it's just a generalized behavior of a capitalist system.
I'm going to be looking at unemployment along with all the other plots. You can see plots in, you know, all the other interfaces, kind of giving specific details on the different sectors. But I would basically, I'm going to aim for, you know, that 2% inflation, good growth, low unemployment, you know, the popular macroeconomic definitions in the ranges that we all like. So I'm going to try to keep it there. I don't know. I'll introduce some shocks. You can see right now inflation's going down. Unemployment's going up. Real output is going up. So that's a positive. That means
make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, comment, talk in the chat. I don't care what you talk about, but make sure you're doing that. Let's help this channel grow. Let's carry on with the video.
Positive. That means, you know, we're probably going to turn this around the business cycle. And I got to think about, okay, we are going just about at 3% inflation now. I don't want interest rates to go up if I believe that monetary policy is going to have an effect. So what I'm going to do is start purchasing bonds. So I'm getting the central bank to purchase bonds. That's injecting reserves into the banking system, and which has a downward pressure on the cash rate. And you know what, every government.
So in this initial model, this was before I added what's called interest on reserves, which creates a floor. And it's what I would call a leaky floor. And what I mean by leaky is that not all accounts with the Federal Reserve get interest on reserves, just financial institutions like banks. Whereas like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, they don't get reserves. So there is, even with a floor, which is interest on reserves, meaning a bank's not going to lend to other banks at an interest rate less than what they'd get from the central bank just holding the reserves. And so essentially it creates a floor. And then the ceiling is the discount window. So a commercial bank's not going to get a loan from another commercial bank if they can just get a cheaper rate from the central bank itself, called the discount window. And that creates a channel. And so what I'm doing right here is I'm doing just open market operations that control the interest rate without those constraints. And then, of course, in later versions and more empirical versions, I've added that. And so then the interbank rate, the Fed funds rate, travels between that channel of the upper limit, the we'll call it a leaky roof, and then a soggy floor. It travels in between that.
Some, you know, government spending into the firm sector, buying things that's got to exist. So we'll boost a little government spending here. We're keeping rates really low, probably about 0.3%. Sometimes on the slow setting, the simulation will stall. You just hit the pause button and then hit play again, and it'll go again. And so I'm seeing that the unemployment rate is turning around. Okay, so there's some positive news. We're getting really strong growth, but there's still some disinflation happening. I'm watching that go down. So I'm not going to be
I shouldn't have used the word disinflation. What I should have said there. I found a cringeworthy moment. What I should have said is that inflation is dropping, and I'm actually right at the 2% mark. So I used the wrong term there.
going to be doing anything with rates. And as you can see, there's three rates. There's an aggregate bond yield rate. There's the bank interest rate, what people are, the effective federal funds rate maybe. And then the the interbank lending rate is the federal funds effective rate. The bank interest rate is what the consumer is paying for interest. I'm seeing inflation is slowing. That's a positive thing. Maybe I want a little more government spending, and we'll add some neoliberal policies in there. We'll start taxing different sectors.
Tax
here.
them
We'll just
all.
go 1%,
Woo!
1%. We'll say 10% for the
Tax.
household. With taxes, they gotta pay for government spending. And if you're an MMT, you're probably cringing right now that
We're all cringing. I'm cringing at this old video. You guys are cringing at me. The MMTers are cringing at everything. It's just one big cringe fest here.
I said that, but we got to play the neoliberal game here. Inflation's still going low. Obviously, when you make any policy option decision in this model, there are legs, and it's not even that I design the legs. So when you have a stock, you have an inflow and an outflow, that creates a first order leg. So there's natural legs, and now I'm seeing some inflation pick up. So I'm gonna stop buying bonds.
So remember, all these dynamics, I'm influencing them by policy options, but there would be a business cycle no matter what I did if I just let this model run, and the economy would probably collapse after a while. The free market isn't as perfect as we all like to believe. It's just not the reality. And in fact, the free market is enabled by strong public institutions, right? Without those, a really efficient free market couldn't exist. That's the truth of it, right? Humans don't do things efficiently. They do things through war and battle and attrition, right? And if you apply that to a supply and demand curve, things get a little bit crazy. And even the most efficient markets on the world, and Alex would know this, the stock market, right? That is an institutional shrine of capitalism, right? And without Wall Street, which was heavily supported by the U.S. government, that's the reality of it, right? It's an institutional structure. We don't have those efficient free markets.
It looks like I might have let things get out of control here.
Oh, I've let things get out of control.
What this is going to do is going to push up the interbank.
So if you run a dynamic system like this, even if you're the builder of it, and especially this one, because it's 1,000 equations, and what did I say, 37,000 feedback loops, you can run it differently with a different set of initial conditions each time, and each time you run it, you don't know what's going to happen, right? You kind of have an idea qualitatively what you can do in a certain situation, but it kind of shows that it's like forecasting the weather economics, right? It's a complex system. You're never going to be perfect. And the further you go out in time, the further that cone of uncertainty gets.
Right, which is the green line you'll see under interest rates. Bond yields are going up. The market rate's going up. Everything's going up. We're seeing a bit of crash now.
Everything's going up. You win a new car. You win a new car.
Unemployment starting.
You remember that Oprah episode? Every time I hear like this is happening, that's happening, and this is going to happen, I think about that episode where Oprah Winfrey gave a car to everybody in the audience. Every time I think about that. I don't know if I wish I had the GIF here. I could put it on screen.
Starting to tick up. Inflation has gone through the roof. We'll try to keep interest rates. Maybe I think we'll go up to 4%. And then we'll back this off. We'll start purchasing bonds again and just kind of level it off at 4%, we'll say. So the cash rate or the interbank rate is going to affect bond yields or papers.
Now, at the time when I was running it, I didn't really identify what the situation I was in there, but I was in some stagflation. Real growth, you can see in the firm output growth graph, the second graph on the top, it's right down close to zero. Nominal's up there because of inflation. And unemployment's rising, and then of course inflation's high. I was in a very stagflation type situation there, and then my rates, I had been jacking them up, and of course you can control in the model the Fed funds rate, but then you have the market rates, and that's your first graph in the top row. You have your market rate, your bond rates and stuff that you don't control. The system itself is endogenously generating that.
Papers to prove that bond yields are heavily influenced by the policy rate. And obviously, the market rate's influenced by the policy rate. It's going to be a little higher, obviously. There's not going to be a big discount on it. Inflation's going down. That's great. I'm going to pump down cash rate a bit. I'm going to add some more government spending.
You are now relearning economics.
Sorry, guys. I didn't mean to play the intro again. Let's carry on the video. I had a button mash in there.
Just to kickstart the economy. Go up to 15% of GDP now. Yeah, maybe. You know what? We got some direct household spending, some social programs, social assistance, welfare, small scale UBI. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. And you can see this model is basically generating endogenous cycles, right? And it's a demonstration on how intricate, a national economy is. There are no static states that you're ever going to get to. You're always going to be constantly fine-tuning your parameters to get the,
I hate it when people use the word intricate, and I just did it there. I think I've removed that from my vocabulary. I just hate that word, and I apologize that I said it 14 months ago.
The ideal, and I can see we are hitting a bit of deflation here.
Deflation? What?
Might want to bring down my policy rate a bit more here.
Again, there's no deflation there. It's right at 1% there. I was cringy. We're having some reduction in inflation. So disinflation maybe in that situation. How's that?
See if that has an effect. And so some would say, I went into this with post-Keynesian, maybe MMT framework, and there are elements to it. But again, I stripped down all those preconceived notions of economic theory, whether it's Austrian, neoclassical, post-Keynesian, new Keynesian, MMT. I stripped that down to a lot of its base cases, and I took the best parts, the first principles of those theories and developed the model from that. And the emergent behaviors are the result. What you're seeing now are a result of going to those first principles, right? So we are in a low rate environment. Inflation's coming up. I don't want to buy bonds anymore.
I don't want to buy bonds anymore.
Rate of inflation. I'm seeing another business bubble collapse. We're 5 years.
I was trying to press another button and do it discreetly, and I didn't do it too well there. I apologize, Alex. Graham, good to see you. Question: should tax be used to control inflation, and what would result be if we increase tax on the banking sector? Not a whole lot, because I can run it in this model. If you want to affect inequality, you want to actually tax the wealthy people, and that's I know people will say, well, they'll just move their assets to another country. Maybe they're financial assets, but they can't move railroads to another country. But as for your first part of your question, I don't think it's a good idea to try to control inflation with tax. And I'll answer that in a second.
5 years into this model run and simulation time, we're going to have a bout of inflation here. Let's introduce a shock, a productivity shock. So productivity is going to go up. See what happens here.
I'm using the original Phillips curve. So what Bill Phillips actually wrote in 1956. And so the conventional version of the Phillips curve is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Bill Phillips never said that. So I would just suggest everybody read his 1956 paper and understand the different components of it. There was actually 3 factors to it, and I'll bring that paper up and I'll read it, and we'll just keep playing the video, and we'll go back to this old heretic as well as Graham's question about tax.
Remember, if your simulation stalls, just restart it. So productivity's gone up, and I'm seeing some immediate effects right away. Inflation. So, and that makes sense. Our economy's more productive. It's going to be disinflationary. Probably going to want to lower interest rates. Again. And I'm probably going to want to pump in some government spending here to really capitalize on the technological innovations that we're seeing as we've introduced this productivity shock. I'm going to go up to 25% of GDP for government spending. I'm going to go up to 15% on households, 16%, sure. Capitalists, we'll go up to 5%, 6%, sure. Banks, we're neoliberal. Okay, we'll pretend we're neoliberals. We can't tax them too much, but sure, we can tax the productive sector.
There I go again, pretending I'm neoliberal, taxing people. Pesky government taxing our money away. Jeez.
Or 6%. So we've got some taxation going on. Looking like we're still in a downward progression on inflation. So it's disinflationary right now. That kind of makes sense as we're in a productivity boom.
So I just brought up paper because old heretic had asked, are you using a Phillips curve type model? Does it compensate for all the times that Phillips curves fails to predict a causal relationship? The Phillips curve that conventional economists use is not Bill Phillips' original concept of what the Phillips curve actually was. And so DSG models do not employ a Phillips curve properly to the tradition of what Bill Phillips said. So I'll actually read the first page because he postulated 3 things in the Phillips curve that was more applicable to what he was actually saying. So it starts off: when the demand for a commodity or service is high relative to the supply of what we expect the price to rise, the rate of rise being greater than the excess of demand. Conversely, when demand is low relative to supply, we expect the price to fall. The rate of fall being greater than the rate of deficiency of demand. It seems plausible that this principle should operate as one of the factors determining the rate of change of money wage rates. Notice how he says money wage rates, which are the price of labor services. When the demand of labor is high and there are very few unemployed, we should expect employers to bid wage rates up quite rapidly. each firm and each industry being continually tempted to offer a little above the prevailing rates to attract the most suitable labor from the others reluctant to offer their services at less than the prevailing rates when the rates fall only very slowly. The relationship between unemployment and the rate of change of wage rates, remember, wage rates, is therefore likely to be highly non-linear. It seems possible that the second factor, now we're in the second factor, influencing the rate of change of money wage rates might be the rate of change of demand for labor and so of unemployment. Thus, in a year of rising business activity with the demand for labor increasing and the percentage of unemployment decreasing, employers will be bidding up more vigorously for services of labor than they would be in a year during which average percent of unemployment was the same, but the demand for labor was not increasing. Conversely, in a year of falling business activity, the demand for labor decreasing and the percentage of unemployment increasing, employers will be less inclined to grant wage increases, and workers will be in a worker position to press them than they would be in a year during which the average percent of unemployment was the same, but the demand for labor was not decreasing. And a third factor, and so this is a third factor which may affect the rate of change of money wage rates. Remember, he's saying money wage rates here is the rate of change of retail prices operating through the cost of living adjustments in wage rates. It will be argued here, however, that the cost of living adjustments will have little or no effect on the rate of change of money wage rates, except in times when retail prices are forced up by very rapid rise in import prices. And he saw that this was in the context of the United Kingdom's back in the 50s, and he ran it back, I think it was 30 years. So essentially, he's postulating three things in what he was saying, and it never was a simple relationship between prices for goods and services and unemployment. He never postulated that. But if I bring that actually back up, where people caught onto that, and might have been his fault, is a footnote. I'll bring it back up here because this is important as well. Share screen window. And I'll see if I can find it. I believe it's at the very end of the paper, and it's a footnote. These conclusions, of course, are tentative. There is a need for much more detail and research into the relationships between unemployment and wage rate prices on productivity. So the very final line of this is what economists do. Not like a solid researcher like myself, we go back and we read these papers from top to bottom. But economists, on the other hand, they just read the footnote. And they get to the end in the conclusion, and they say, okay, well, that's it, perfect. We understand the system. So that is kind of what Bill Phillips said, and that's what my model employs. So I'm looking at prices on imports, right? I'm looking at the relationship of money wages and demand for laborers, right? And then I'm looking at the institutional power structures of the economy, so the different interacting systems, and I build a true to nature Phillips curve that way. And as for the tax, Graham, no. And the simple reason I say that is imagine how dysfunctional politics is now in the US. And the way they want to control inflation is through taxation. How do you do that? How do you make taxes variable quick enough on demand versus a very blunt tool that we don't like is interest rates? How do you do that? It's just, it seems implausible to do unless you're using something like Dave Folks would advocate for, which is a transaction tax. So very, very small micro tax on each transaction, right? Maybe, and this is something Dave and I discussed last week, is we might model this to see if that is an applicable way to control prices through taxation. But other than that, it would have to be some automatic system. You couldn't be passing federal tax changes in Congress, every 3 days to control inflation, or every week or every month. It wouldn't be applicable. So that's why I'm not a supporter of using the tax system to control price changes, the rate of change of the price level. I just, that seems unfathomable to me in a realistic sense.
As we're in a productivity boom. We'll keep that productivity boom going. If we go over and look at the miscellaneous plots, you'll see that jump in the red line here. That's the productivity boom. So that's a flow. And then the stock is, goods per worker per year. So that's the gray shaded area. So we're definitely, more productive right now. It's definitely going to cause some sort of instability in the system.
I agree too. I think we,
and we'll say,
I think we agree for different reasons. So Frank says the only thing I agree with Austrians and libertarians with is tax is a theft of producers' income, since the price was agreed upon, but after tax was not paid in full. The one thing I really disagree with, one of the worst regressive taxes out there, is tax on production, tax on profits, right? And I'm talking about firms that create products that we consume as consumers. That's the worst kind of tax you can have.
But whatever that productivity boom was, it stops now. We're kind of returned to normal levels. The shock is over, and we'll see what happens here. Obviously, I think we'll get a turnaround in inflation. Maybe, unless there's some other dynamics at play. I'll tell you, each run.
So Graham says, I was thinking more of a tax is a way of behavioral change. Example, tax on cigarettes or luxury items. Sure, but you just can't change that all the time. You have to establish it and let the behavior emerge from the policy over time. But as a way to control inflation or anything, I don't think that's possible. Unless we're thinking about a transaction tax, which Dave Folks pushed a couple weeks ago on the Dr. Keynes and Mr. Keynes live stream. I think it was about 2 weeks ago. And it's pretty interesting to me, a transaction tax as an alternative to a federal income tax and a state income tax.
Depending on your initial conditions, and I have a set of initial conditions to kind of start this model, where there's kind of a higher unemployment, higher inflation. Every decision you make, depending on the time point, is going to create a different result in this model. So one policy option at one point in this model will have one set of effects, whereas at another point of the model, the effects could be completely different. And I'm seeing inflation is sitting right at 1%. Obviously, we'll pretend we're central bankers. We're going to be aiming for at least 2%. Oh, it's starting to bump there. See, yeah, it's starting to go up there. That's a cool, to introduce these shocks, right? These exogenous shocks, because outside of that, this model will just run endogenously with different cycles and business cycles on its own. We are seeing a huge kick up in inflation. So I'm talking, instead of, policy, making policy decisions, I'm going to think of actually going to have to sell bonds to the.
Yeah, I'm not a big Georgianism fan. So essentially, because you're saying that even land just generates wealth, Keynes said any idle resources is essentially not wealth, right? So it's only when you employ those idle resources that it becomes wealth. Even Adam Smith says wealth is a conversion from labor. So you're taking a rock and you're forming it into a stone tool to, I don't know, break something else apart, and then that's the creation of wealth. So I don't really factor in. It's more of an ideology statement, and so price and wealth comes out of the Kalecki kind of term in this model. So you have, your cost plus markups really is what generates inflation, and empirically it is the best way to approach why we have inflation. I've done the work. I'll actually bring up the chart and show that the Kalecki way, Mikhail Kalecki, is the way to go when determining wealth creation, price inflation, etc., etc.
The banking sector here. We'll kick that up, start selling 10% of our bonds per year back to the banking sector to boost the interbank lending rate. Inflation is rising, getting close to 3% now. And I am trying to sell bonds, extracting reserves out of the system to boost the interbank lending rate. And we're seeing a turnaround in inflation. I'm going to stop selling at this point. And so we could introduce, let's say, something like a pandemic situation. So let's do that. We'll introduce a pandemic shock. We're shutting down a bunch of the economy. Instant unemployment shoots up.
Oh, here we go.
Growth goes negative.
Here we go.
And we're probably
what I'm about to do here is, so when I was saying earlier in the show that DSG models creates time by introducing the shocks, whereas system dynamic model is an accumulation of time, right? It's path dependent, but you can still introduce a shock. And this shock here is what I'm showing why we had the effects of inflation during the pandemic. But what I want to bring up here is, I was just mentioning Mikhail Kalecki. So I did a little expanded experiment with his equation. So his cost plus markup equation through time. And I had to modify it quite a bit. But essentially its foundation was Kalecki. And the red line is the model inflation since it's 2002, something like that, up until now. And I ran the model and tested it against the black data, which is CPI, less energy and less food. So it's excluding those two things. And it came with a remarkably good fit for 20 years, right? So I could have optimized a 5-year period and got the red line and black line to match perfectly. But just the underlying idea that Kalecki's price plus markup, it is the most empirical way to measure, put that in a model and say, okay, this is a good predictive equation to see where inflation's going to go. And that's what I use in the model. Now, this is discrete time chunks in there, so it's every quarter, and that's why it's a jagged line, not smooth integration. But it worked out really well, and including during the pandemic, where I didn't expect it to react at all to what we saw in CPI after the pandemic, because this was discrete time chunks, and it had a spike in inflation as well. So that's what I use in this model, and of course in the model it's now a lot more calibrated than it is what you're seeing on screen. This was just a base case test scenario with discrete time data, and that's what we came up with.
See some deflation here. And we're going to want to counteract that by dropping interest rates to 0, which they're kind of already at. We'll make sure they stay there by purchasing, because we are going to dump a bunch.
So what you see here is the way I simulated the pandemic shock is I just turned down the capital utilization rate, which is a variable function in my model, but I do have control over it. And this is something that conventional DSG models do not do, right? They're a supply and demand thing. And so they did not. If you look at the best DSGE model on the planet, which is run by the Federal Reserve, it predicted flat inflation. And then when the next set of data came up, they just shocked the equilibrium level of inflation higher, and it showed it would just return to its 2% trend. It never happened. It never showed it. In this model, in a simple qualitative model, so this isn't empirically tested, I'm just running the model as we go, I introduced a shock similar to the pandemic, and we're going to see the same results, the qualitative results of what we saw during the pandemic. So we're seeing high unemployment, of course, because we shut down the economy. We saw output rocket down. We saw inflation dip down, and we're going to see all the same behavior over the coming year in this model run
into household accounts as a measure so people can still pay their mortgages. There are bankruptcies in this model. So we'll pump that up. 50% of GDP, direct household payments. Oh, and I have pressed that button so much it's going up to 62. We'll leave it at 62. And things are not good right now for the economy. We'll boost firm investment, government investment into firms way up there. And we'll say, okay, our lockdown's over. We're going to return to normal. And this is very discrete, instantaneous stuff here. And we're going to stop.
So this is where I've turned off the shock in capital utilization, meaning the economy can utilize its normal amount of capital that it has. And in the US economy, that fluctuates between 80 and 75% capital utilization rate. And the model has its own function to generate that variable rate of capital utilization. And I've discovered in my research it's directly a causal a loop from actual employment. So if you're employing more people, you have to use more of your factory. And let's see what the results of returning the economy to normal is after the fact.
Payments.
And keep in mind what I did is I increased government spending already. Right away, I introduced, direct household spending. So that kind of represented income for households, benefits if they were unemployed. I increased benefits to firms as well. And I did that right at the beginning.
To households. Put it back down to, we'll say 10%. We'll say there's some improvements to the direct household payments method. Might have pressed that button too many times. 10, there we go. We're going to return government spending back down to.
So now I'm taking away those benefits. The pandemic lockdowns are over, and we're just carrying on. People are starting to go back to work. In this model run, inflation CPI was relatively low. That's because I'm not doing a qualitative exact example of 2020, May of 2020, or anything like that. I'm just doing a generalized shock that was similar to the shock that we saw during COVID-19.
30. So now we've kind of simulated a pandemic lockdown in this model. Return to real high growth, unemployment's back to normalization, low inflation, but I suspect we're going to have an inflation problem here coming up. I'm going to try to be proactive in that inflation problem. I'm going to boost rates now. I think might have been late. I know, that the head.
So in the bottom, I know it's hard to see, and I can't zoom in the different parts, but you'll see money supply, and you'll see a red line which represents bank deposits, and then a blue line which represents settlement balances, which are reserves, and they've both increased dramatically. It doesn't look like settlement balances have increased dramatically reserves, because it's on the same axis as bank credit, which is a lot bigger number.
The heterodox opinion was monetary austerity is not a good thing, but it can prevent shocks and inflation. And I think if they're added at the right time and then reduced at the right time, they could make maybe.
So we're seeing output just like after the pandemic, as the economy opened back up again, it shoot through the roof. And of course, unemployment's gone way down. And again, this isn't an exact representation of the pandemic during 2020 in the spring. It's just a qualitative example of introducing a shock similar to the pandemic, shutting down the economy. What should happen?
Maybe a difference. We're going to try to do that here. I can see inflation is taking off. So I'm going to be purchase or selling a ton, basically unwinding the Fed balance sheet. And I'm going to attempt to raise the interbank lending rate. And so this.
Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave comments underneath the video. That always helps. Alex, I always know you're in there. Frank, I see you in there. I think everybody in the chat, you guys are always leaving chat comments after there. It helps with the algorithm, pushes it out to other people. So always appreciate you guys doing that.
And so this set of circumstances isn't necessarily an exact clone of what happened after the pandemic, because I'm not doing the timing right? But it's just showing you the simulation, how the behavior of my policy was happening. And we are having that inflation bump that we saw. Unfortunately, we're in a bit of a low growth environment. Market rates are going up, and inflation's peaked out just under 6%. And it's coming back down. That probably means I want to be proactive. Don't want to keep raising the interbank lending rate. Maybe actually stall it out here. So we'll start purchasing again.
They're going to comment on that, Graham. Landlords are really parasites. I think that's an interesting statement to make, and I have an opinion on it, believe it or not.
So I think you're kind of getting the point, of this model and what you can do and simulate different events. We can pause it here because we're getting close to the end of the video, and we can carry this on indefinitely. We can look at like some of the other, sectors. And so this is the household sector. You can see, household balances are up to $5.8 billion right now. There's $159 billion in nominal capital. Those would be houses. And then debt sits at $126 billion. Household sectors in positive territory for equity at $37 billion.4. Kind of some of the graphs here, the equity, how it's evolved over time. Concerning here is this declining income share to gross domestic income. That's problematic. During the pandemic part of the simulation, investment in new houses dropped off. So there's an issue right there, in housing, for instance. We can look at the firm sector. Firm sectors, definitely had a big problem during the pandemic simulation shock we introduced. And I'm looking at this plot right here. So it's a huge drop, but it's gone in its cycle, but it's remained fairly flat in this cycle. The inventory level is dropping precipitously until the COVID experiment that we performed. So that's kind of telling. That's what we've seen in the real world. We can look at our bank interface. So what this is showing is obviously the share of income for banks, that massive rate increase there to stop inflation towards the end of the model run. Well, that's obviously going to boost their income. But we actually saw kind of a peak, a big rise at the beginning and then a slow decline. That's kind of interesting. Private debt ratios obviously spiked during the simulated pandemic. you kind of see these three graphs here. So this green line is your household share of income. It's a slow decline, and while capitalist is a slow increase over time. So that's relatively interesting. Monetary authority, pretty much the same plots we see on the main interface. The fiscal authority, which is the treasury. This is the red line is your government spending. This is your taxation. The difference is a deficit, which is offset by bond sales in the economy. And as you can see, the three entities that hold bonds in this version of the model, there seems to be a big spike during the COVID part of the simulation, or the pandemic part of the simulation. When we introduced that shock, banks started holding a lot of bonds.
It's a reaction video to an old video I did. I want a very so Matt says, is this old work from Ty or current? This was kind of the prototype model that we now use at Modern Macro Technologies. So this was a qualitative model just to see if the structure worked correctly. So that's what we're watching here. And I did this video and I plan to laugh at myself today, but I'm laughing more at laugh at myself back then, but I'm laughing at myself today. So the cringeworthiness never ends with me, Matt, but this is from about 14 months ago.
That ratio obviously went through the roof during the pandemic shock. We've got household plots here. Clearly, we're seeing that neoliberal effect there as the rich just keep on getting richer. They survived the pandemic portion of the shock pretty good. And then some miscellaneous shocks. So we have like initial firm purchases here, growing market over time. Seems like some sort of a rebound here after the lockdowns, which we saw in the real world. You know, after markets collapse, there was a huge rebound. Probably a lot of that from fiscal stimulus. We can see the firm capital utilization rate. What I did to simulate a pandemic situation is I reduced capital utilization, which reduces unemployment. And then, of course, we had a productivity shock, which you can kind of see right there, and that adjusts the overall level of productivity. It went faster for that period of time and then returned to normal. Anyways, the model is downloadable if you are a paid Patreon member. On my Patreon, Relearning Economics.
Well, that wasn't so bad, you know. That wasn't so cringy. I actually think I gave a pretty good rundown there. Anyways, I think I was more cringeworthy here, to be honest. So I should do my Ric Flair, woo, and what? My Stone Cold what? Let's see what's going on in the chat here. Good question, Alex. I thought private debt was paid down as well. Not sure if it's actually correct. I don't know what the model did there. And again, like, because it wasn't, you know, timed out exactly and it wasn't using empirical data, I wouldn't obviously put everything into, you know, exact context of that. But let's check out what private sector debt, because you got to remember you have the private sector is not just households. It's, you know, it's different classes of households, and then you have the firm sector as well. So I'm just looking at loans and leases, and I'm going to change that from a rate of change from a year ago. And it spiked, it dropped down. So I'll show the chart here. Share, just do a quick I won't download it. Chrome tab, share. Make sure we'll make this big. Take out the chat. So, you know, it's spiked down. And this is, of course, a rate of a change over from the year before. So during at the beginning of COVID, when everything locked down, credit accelerated extremely fast. and then it dropped down as the economy was being opened back up. And then once everything was opened back up, we've seen a steady rise and through 2023 to 2024 in credit, and now it's returned back down, and now we're seeing a slow acceleration of credit again. So there's some telling aspects there. I'll tell you, credit behaves differently. So the credit cycle is generally shorter than the business cycle. So you could see about 4 different cycles within a generalized business cycle, right? So it doesn't match the business cycle itself. And as you can see right there, that's the rate of change of new loans and leases. And I will remove well, let's see if I can even turn that off. Stop sharing. I'll see if I can find another chart as well in there. So you can have like a household debt. So household debt. And that drop, now that's comparing it to personal income, and because personal income went down, that kind of gets, so we want a stock of household debt. Private debt. Well, I could look for it. I'll look for it. Explain that. I'll post that in the next show. I don't feel like looking for it now. I want to talk to you guys, right? How are you guys doing? Old Heretic. What do we got here? How does your model compensate for varying levels of greed, inflation pressure? So I covered this. I don't know if you were here earlier. So my model uses the Mikhail-Koletsky version of inflation and the price level. So it's a cost plus markup. And markups are variable based on profit. So Hyman Minsky said as profits go up, firms become more euphoric and they start investing more, right? They start taking out more debt. And the Austrians actually love Minsky for this, right? It's almost like a form of malinvestment. Well, I postulated in my dynamic model, and then we matched this in empirical data to our empirical model, that firms also get euphoric in their cost plus pricing markups. You call it greedflation. I don't like that term because I just call it capitalism. That's what firms do. When I ran a small business and I saw an opportunity to rise prices in a market environment, I did it. That greed? Yeah, that was greed, but that's what I'm in business for, to make profits. If you're not making profits, you're not staying in business. So that's how it addresses greedflation. I use Mikhail-Koletsky's cost plus markup inflation, which is the basis of all of Isabella Weber's work, right? Without Koletsky, that theory doesn't even exist. So that's how I address it in the model. Graham. In the UK, I think self-employed people didn't get any government help, so I'm sure they had to borrow to survive. Yeah, so if you look at a micro level, some people had to borrow, some people didn't. So if we had the data, and I don't know what the data collection is like in the UK, you could easily see that obviously self-employed people might have taken out credit, but you could also advocate that self-employed people had a little more latitude with how they behaved during work. Yeah, you had specific government level lockdowns, and firms were employing those lockdown procedures because they didn't want to be liable for anything. But you could say a self-employed person might have had a little more flexibility, but you would have to look at the data, right? We could only subjectively guess here in that case. What else do we have? Those models are funny because I could simulate loads of pandemics and everything would be fine after. But if you went out into the street, people would be starving from the explosion of inequality. And so in the model, see, here's the thing. In that model, the capitalist system breeds inequality for households, and that's because of private sector debt. And we can look at the data. And so, as we've seen from the 1970s, the financial sector has grown and their share of income to GDP has grown. Well, the households, the medium households' share of income has declined from the 1970s. So that's built into capitalism, like late term capitalism. And one of my, I'm not much of a progressive per se. I'm just interested in modeling a complex system. That's what I do. All right, that's what I'm hired to do, is model complex systems and see the emergent behaviors from them. But if I was being a progressive, the one thing I would target most in current capitalist systems is the growth of the financial sector. We need it. I make money from it, but we should heavily regulate it, right? And we should reduce regulation on productive firms. And that's not an absent of ecological concerns. So, productive firms that make things for us and where it gives us a better material standard of living, they still have to be regulated from an ecological standpoint. But with the financial sector, it needs to be regulated and constrained because of an income distribution issue, right? And unfortunately, households are getting the raw end of it. The common worker is getting the raw end of the stick in that process. What else do we have here? I'll just go through them all here. Would be hard for them to borrow. Probably would need to sell assets or put assets on collateral. That's precisely what capitalists do. Cost plus markup. That is the way to go. But inflation is never just one thing. Not that Ty is making that claim. No, it's not. But essentially, inflation is costs, right? And a big cost, and people hate to hear this on the left, is wages, right? And I actually watched a seminar given by Steve right before. That's why I did this live stream a little bit later today. And I watched Steve, right? And one of his arguments is, wages is a part of costs for firms. So if wages are going up, inflation's going to be going up. And of course, firms will put a markup on top of that. And so the idea in a perfect world is that we had firms and workers come together to find an equitable rate. And so this might even go to a little bit to the Austrians, saying just let the free market, let's not have unions, right? And let the workers and capitalists come to an agreeable wage. Now, in practice, I don't ever see that working. We see so many examples of workers that are doing work that we all enjoy. And let's use a basic example, McDonald's workers. Now, they're not adding an extreme amount of value to our economy, or a Walmart worker, which I think they are adding value because we get cheap goods from China and we're serviced by people working at Walmart. They're crushed. They're not getting a fair wage. Like, you might say, well, that's, you're pumping gas or you're working at Walmart. That's hard labor. That's real work you're doing, right? And they're not getting paid the amount they should be getting paid. I can make a lot of money doing consultation and mathematical models. And I got a question sometimes, am I really adding, like, I'd like to think that because some of my projects are for the progressive case, that it does add value. But I got to ask myself, why do I deserve to earn more than somebody that's busting their balls, pumping gas, or, pushing carts down, the back warehouses of Walmart or Amazon, right? So there's plenty of examples showing that the system doesn't really look out for workers, right? But on the flip side of that, I also know, being a small business owner in my 20s, running a small business is extremely hard. And I took my costs and then I put a markup on top of them so I could make a profit. And if I saw a time in the business cycle and the credit cycle, and I wasn't at the time saying, oh, what's the credit cycle right now? I got to raise rates. But if I saw an opportunity to mark up my prices quicker than my costs, I would, because that's more profits, right? And that helps me starve off a time when business is bad, right? So it's part of the economic cycle, right? Now, greedflation gets amplified when we consolidate firms into big mega corporations. That's a problematic issue with greedflation, right? But an individual firm going out there and marking up their prices, bottom line, if they mark them up too much and there's competitors, the customers will go to another place. But if you just have a single corporation like Amazon, Walmart, right, or whatever big corporation you could think of, if they get greedy, and we call it greedflation if you want to, and they market, but the consumer has nowhere else to go, and some of the products that they're selling are the sustained life, and that's problematic, right? What else have we got here? Graham, credit cards. These are easy. Credit cards. Agreed. Credit cards. In aggregation, the price level obscures the extent to which inflation is differential. Yes. So when I'm doing so with modern macro technology in my macro model, we're looking at what's going to happen in the macro system, and figuring out what the best solution is for investors, right? But if you wanted to look at things like inequality, you could do a more hybrid model between micro and macro, right? And dig down and drill down. So every macro model, if you're using basing macro definitions from macro definitions, you have the ability to drill down and model deeper and deeper. What you can't do is model upwards. So micro foundations is a myth of new Keynesian and neoclassical economics, right? You need micro foundations in order to build macro. But if you look at physics and engineering, they completely reject that idea. You don't build from the micro level to study a macro phenomenon. But yeah, no, it's very dependent on what you're studying, what level, what degree of abstraction from the real world individual you want to be at. And that comes down to a problem, right? So if you're studying things like inflation, interest rates, unemployment, GDP, you'd use a macro model. If you're studying things like inequality, right? Income distribution, income inequality, income distribution within the GDP framework. You can look at that from an aggregated model and then drill down into a micro model. Frank. Very true. Prices are raised in order to make profit, but if prices on businesses are raised due to higher rates or costs of production, capitalists will need to raise them to maintain current profits. Exactly. And that's what Koleski's cost plus markup equation is to determine inflation, right? So if costs go up, firms just mark up a little bit more if they're in an industry with low competition, right? And we're in that point of, in our developed countries like the UK, US, Australia, Japan, Canada, et cetera, where we've seen a consolidation of a lot of firms into these mega corporations, right? And so we're seeing disproportionate cost plus markups from those firms to be advantageous. They're capitalists, right? That's what you do when you raise a firm. When you raise interest rate, it is cost to firms. And there's the MMT argument that raising rates is inflationary to the economy because you're raising costs. So you're marking up the costs. And of course, what do firms do to compensate, to keep their margins at least the same as they mark up, right, their prices? But you also have to remember that affects every other parts of the economy. So it depresses actually people. So if it's in raising a blunt tool like raising interest rates, it's going to raise it for households too. And that's a cost for them, which means it lowers their bank account, which lowers their ability to consume more, which ultimately depresses the economy. So when I ran it dynamically in the system, and I could do it again, if I were to drill down and look, so remember my model goes in 16-hour increments, essentially, right? You could postulate, if I drill down, look at the one-time step of where interest rates went up by, let's say, 1%, big 100 basis point jump, you could probably see prices actually rise for a minute, but then depress, right? Especially if it's a big interest rate jump. So it's, in a dynamic sense, it's very common. If you look at it in a static sense, it's easy for you to have the opposing opinions from either side. Conventional economists say, well, that just depresses the economy instantly. We hit a new point in equilibrium. Modern monetary theory says, well, the next point in time, inflation's higher. But if you're doing it dynamically and you have the endogenous behavior of both credit cycles and the business cycle, you're going to actually experience a lot of different emergent behaviors. One point, the inflation might be slightly higher, and then it drops like a rock. And of course, if it drops like a rock, then costs get lowered, right? And if costs are going lower because wages and unemployment goes down, then firms suddenly have more profit. And then you see a big jump in the next business cycle and you get instability in the system. So when you look at a complex system, it's not like looking at a static system or a comparative statics where you look at one static point, the next static point, right? You've got this non-linear emergent behavior that's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating to model, right? And it also does blur the lines between the different schools where one specific economic school will have this is what A will do to B and B will happen. And the other school says, well, this is what will actually happen to B and the next point in time. But none of them are looking at it from a dynamic standpoint that normal sciences do all the time, like engineers, right? They don't just say, the wheel turns over, it goes over the rock and that's the next point. Well, actually, the car goes over the rock. There's a dynamic feedback level into the shocks, and then the shocks start oscillating. They build a constant in there, the shock that reduces that, right? And then the car might lose steering, right? It's modeling through time and all those emergent behaviors that come after. I hope that answered your question. Inflation is a business strategy. Well, I don't think so. When I ran a small business, and I didn't think, oh, inflation is my strategy. Making profits was my strategy, right? So if I could reduce costs to increase my profits, I would do that. If I could increase prices without losing customers, I would do that. And of course, I'm doing that when I ran my trucking company. I was locked into a lot of 1-year contracts, so I couldn't necessarily just raise my prices. So they'd come in discrete chunks. What else we got here? Alex, Mr. Jenkinson. The only fundamental force that keeps wages up is the requirement to let them rise a little. I'm assuming you forgot A, future workers. Rise a little, future workers. Cantillon said they should be paid twice what they need to sustain themselves. Maybe, but that would be a huge cost to firms, and we just went through what would happen at that point. And then so firms mark up their prices, and then you can't. It just becomes a wage spiral. So I don't know. Don't know about that. Frank, what's Frank's opinion? Let's get Frank's opinion. No, unions, then you need to eliminate monopolies as well. Otherwise, no negotiating power on one end. So you're saying that even with the need of unions in the existence of monopolies or mega corporations are quite useless. I would say, and unfortunately, they're both going. We're seeing the rise of mega corporations and the decline of unions. I would say that the counteracting force are big unionize, and maybe we need big mega unions. I don't know. The suggestion, right? They don't seem to be, even in Canada, where we're compared to the US, where we have public unions, etc., they're in decline, right? And it's problematic because that's kind of like our leverage against big corporations, right? To try to find a fair market rate for wages. Because remember, just because you're aggregating groups doesn't mean the market doesn't exist, right? You're just balancing the power between them all. And then Alex, man, I hate unions so much, especially when they block the footpath when I'm trying to get to work. It's a very ideal. It's, you see, imagine if you're a worker, let's say, Alex, whatever you do for work, and you're going to work and a union has no impact on you and you're earning a good wage and you love what you do and you want to go to work and a union's blocking your way, you would hate unions, right? And so that comes down to the individual. But if you flip the coin, let's say somebody's working really hard, they do love what they do, but they didn't get a package increase or et cetera, right? And legitimately they do deserve to earn more. Well, from their perspective, they're like, well, F you've got a lucky pass and I don't. Now I get to the point where maybe you could say, well, I'm just working harder and I'm smarter, right? But it becomes very complicated when you pick one side or the other, right? So I've gone through different stages in my life where I've been pro-union and anti-union. And it's been very dependent on my own success. So when I was a small business owner, you can imagine I wouldn't say I was anti-union, but I didn't have any use for them. I thought in my own mind that I paid my workers, they were semi-skilled workers, a decent wage. And the more I paid them, the happier they would be and the better the job they did for me. I realized that doesn't always scale up. As I put more trucks on the road, I found the marginal increase in my profits kept declining because quality went down. So just like the idea of money, sometimes when you pay somebody more money, they actually become entitled and don't work as hard. There's that as well. So there's some marginal effects there you could think of. Is profit an emergent property of the model? It's structurally part of the model. So the business cycle is an ebb and flow. If you look back to Marx, right, and you simplify the model to a very base case, right, during times of high wages, profits are lower because costs are higher. And if profits are lower and a portion of profits is used for investment, not all of it, but a portion is used for investment, that means that there's going to be less investment into the capital stock, real machinery and factories, etc. Then there's less employment, wages go down, and then profits go up. So it's a dynamic cycle. The emergent property of the model is private sector debt. The emergent property of the model is the growth of the financial sector. The emergent property of the model is financial instability. Those are emergent properties. But profit is a flow. So it goes up and down, right? Dependent on the business cycle. Matt, not enough space in the chat to explain. Inflation is a business strategy. So I'll put in the comments for anyone who's interested. Please do that. I would be interested to read it. I read all your comments because I'm not a big channel. So at this point, if you are part of this channel, let's say by next year I've blown it up, get your comments in now so we can interact, because one day there could be 100 comments or 200 comments and then I won't be able to get to them all. But put it in the comments. I would appreciate that, Matt, for sure. Frank, I neither prefer monopolies or unions, but you're right. Mega corporations require mega unions. Another spiral like wages with prices increases. Yeah, agree. What else is going on? Frank, were you the one commented on the Blue Jays? You're Canadian, right? Was it you, Frank? Fuck yeah, I'm so happy. Got the bye. Beat out the Yankees by method of tiebreaker. That's going on in my life. That's another story. Hockey season starting. That's going on too. I was thinking, guys, because I look at my metrics for my YouTube and my X. I got lots of North Americans, Canadians, and US. So the algorithm knows where I live, so they pump it out to people in my own country. I thought about doing like a sports live stream separate from economics, right? I was thinking about it because it would be diverse my channel, but I would look at betting strategies, right? And betting models, right? And how to build bet models using dynamic systems or other methods, right? I thought about it. Be fun, right? Be fun to do that. Have a model and then talk about the games, why the model was wrong, and how Ty can't build a sports betting model. I've thought about it though. Good market in sports, commenting on sports game. The problem is I only watch 2 sports essentially. I don't know about you guys, but I'm very like rigid in like, cause I'm 41 now, gonna be 42 soon. I've gotten very repetitive in my pattern of living. So in sports, baseball from April and hopefully the month of October, which is the playoffs this year, it's going to be the month of October. Great. And then hockey it's a few preseason games here in late September. And then hockey essentially starts in the late first week of October. And it's 2 months playoffs, so it goes regular season to April, and then hopefully your team's in it in May and June, and that's my thing. And then within those 2 sports, I cheer for the Blue Jays, the only Canadian baseball team there is, and then for hockey, I'm cheering for the Vancouver Canucks because that's my home team. sort of my home team, close to Vancouver. So yeah. Where is everybody from? Put where you're from in the chat, just out of curiosity. So I did comment, but I'm not Canadian. I'm a New York Yankee fan. Woo! How's those Yankees doing? They got a tough series against Boston. That whole American League East is freaking tough. You've got this year, of course, Toronto. You've got the Yankees. You've got Boston. Tampa Bay, never count them out. They didn't make it this year, but they were a thorn in the Blue Jays side. And then the Orioles, every other year, they're either champions or losers, right? What a tough division. And 3 teams got in from that division. What just a tough. So, and believe it or not, us Blue Jay fans, we want the Yankees. We think we can beat the Yankees more than we can the Red Sox. The Red Sox have some deadly pitching. Their starters just really have our number. And we've gotten to the Yankees all year. We swept you back 4 games straight Canada Day weekend and the 4th of July. Swept you. We just feel better for the Yankees. So anyways, where is everybody? Okay, so Graham, UK. Halen from are we talking about rounders? And I was recently reading the history of baseball, right? And they still haven't determined where it came from, if it was rounders, cricket, and there's so many bat and ball games throughout history that was children games. Nobody even knows where rounders came from, really. Nobody even understands where cricket came from, right? They assume it kind of started in the 13th century, and then by the 15th century they saw the term cricket come up. And same with baseball, right? They saw it written early in American history, so the mid 1750s. They saw terminology of baseball, but it wasn't regularly used. And so the main theories is one of them is it was from rounders, right? But it could have been a variation of many different bat and ball games. But boy, compared to all the major sports leagues, it's a bit of an enigma of where the baseball that we have today came from. Zimbabwe. Ooh, we got Africa in the house. Beautiful stuff. I love it. Virginia. Great. It's like we're the UN here. UN. Matt, where are you from? Maybe you set up in the chat. Oh, you're the one that asked. Well, Matt, if you're the one that asked, where are you from? I'm going to assume America. I think we got the Americans winning the battle today. I'm the only Canadian. We got a few other Canadians that come here and watch. The Friday stream, maybe we'll do this again because that's like my flagship stream when everybody's here from throughout the week. These 2 side shows, it's just like a group of people that come. But maybe Friday I'll ask that question, see what the New Zealand. Okay, we are like the I5 intelligence. Oxford. So we've got New Zealand. Okay, but I'm in Sydney now. Wow. So Dave Folks, the guy I do a stream with on Friday. We were talking about Australia and New Zealand and how there's a friendly rival, much like here in Canada and the US. And apparently, as an Australian, it's a bit of an insult to ask somebody, do you have a stain in your family? And that means that you have a direct descendant that was a criminal from the UK that was sent to Australia. And then you say, do you have a stain? If Tony was here today, Tony Wilson, I want to ask him, do you have a stain in your family? Actually, I'll ask Steve. Steve's Australian. Steve Keen, do you have a stain in your family? But New Zealand's actually a really beautiful, right? So it has no crocodiles that I know of. It has no deadly spiders. It has no bears. It has no mountain lions, tigers, or lions. It doesn't really have poisonous snakes that I know of. So it really seems like a beautiful place to go see. A lot of people say it's like the UK of the Southern Hemisphere, except it gets colder on the south side and then warmer on the north side. Matt, you would know that since you're from there. What else we got here? What's going on here? Graham, why are America's always winning world championships? We just had the Four Nations of hockey 10 months ago. Canada kicked their ass. We smoked them. So they don't win all the championships. They brag about all the championships they win, but they don't win them all. I'll be very sure to clarify that. We can go back and we can watch the Four Nations. We can review that next week. Is economic Five Eyes, definitely. Yes, it's their egos. 100% their egos. Frank. Steve would take it better than Tony. Yeah, Steve would laugh. Tony would get mad. You guys know how Tony is. He's always here in the chat. He's very, and I've done a few live streams with him. Very abrasive, you could say. Very, very opinionated. Great guy, has a big heart, cares about the planet. Matt. Well, it can be a point of pride to have an OG convict in the family, but it depends on the social. Yeah, and so that's what Dave was telling me. It depend. We were talking about it. I think it was after Friday's stream, and he's like, some families, it is a point of pride to be Australian and have one of the original convicts. But I imagine that's changing with the newer sides of things, where it could be quite derogatory. But yeah, interesting. Oh, we got actually from Edmonton. I was actually in Edmonton for work during the last Stanley Cup. The bars were a little sad. Yeah, because that's 2 years in a row they lost to the Florida Panthers. And Connor McDavid, this is a contract signing year, so nobody knows if he's staying there. Now, the Vancouver Canucks are mortal enemies with the Edmonton Oilers and the Calgary Flames, divisional rivalries there. So I could care less. I was cheering when they lost the Stanley Cup. And besides, in hockey, like, it's not like a ton of Americans on that team, ton of Canadians on the Florida team. So either way, right? I could care less. I was disappointed the Canucks didn't even make the playoffs last year. Matt, I'm from the city of Christchurch. We had the big earthquake in 2013. New Zealand is on the ring of fire, so we get quakes. Vancouver is on the ring of fire, just on the opposite side of the Pacific Ocean from you. And we're expecting the big one. We had a minor one that I felt not the other day, a few months ago. And it was, for me, I think some people felt waves. For me, it felt like, if they're doing construction and they use dynamite and you feel that boom, that one pressure wave, that's what it felt like. And it was like, bam. I was like, whoa, wow, that's frightening. Yeah. And where I live, I'm on a bit of a delta. So I think about liquefaction and tsunamis and stuff like that, because I'm right on sea level, quite far in, but in a delta. Yeah, guys, I think we're kind of getting to the end of the stream. I put up a promo on my Patreon, so if you use the promo code Livestream, all capital letters, you get 50% off for this month, your first month as a Patreon member. So my intermediate and up, so my second tier and up in my Patreon members, I give out a lot of models that I do, just so you can learn that stuff. Get early access to my articles. You'll get a copy of my book when it comes out, and I'm also launching a course on system dynamic modeling that I'll do through my Patreon. So it'll have probably 6 modules, and so each tier, tier 1 will get 1 module, tier 2 will get 2 modules, tier 3 3 modules, and my 4th tier will get 4 modules, and the last 2 you'll have to buy separately. So there are those perks, so make sure you sign up there. But yeah, that's about it. It's fun. It was fun looking at myself today. I wasn't in the video. It was fun hearing myself. I thought it'd be a lot more cringier than it actually was. And it just turned out it wasn't so cringy. That's unfortunate. Because I was looking for that cringy kind of feel, you know. What I meant to say. Hold on. What I meant to say, relearning economics is definitely serving as economics 5 eyes. I am. So one of my articles, journal from Australia, a small journal, they want to publish it in one of their monthly journals. So that should be interesting. It was the one where I talked about how neoclassical economics is really just a mask for neoclassical economics. The only difference between the two is new Keynesians have added frictions to their DSG models that are categorically wrong from the first instance. So they just now used a categorically wrong modeling technique and added corrections to it instead of just structurally changing it, or better yet, throwing the theory out in the trash. But anyways, it's fun. We'll be back on Friday with the man himself, Professor Steve Keen, Mike Radzicki, and the rest of the guys, Dave Fulks. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave comments underneath the video. It really helps. We will see you in a couple days. Bye-bye.
You are now relearning economics.